Hello and welcome to EDH Rec's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDH Rec and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week, I'm really excited to discuss my friend and co-editor Chase, aka Mana Curve's brassiest EDH deck. You don't need an Alibi when you have an Alibou. Alibu Ancient Witness is, in Chase's words, and I quote, a total butterscotch dream and an extremely underrated commander. 5 mana 4/5 probably doesn't blow any minds stat-wise, and even the haste effect seems easy to overlook, but that damage effect is wild. Attacking with even just one little artifact creature will cause Alibu to lob an enormous amount of damage to someone's face, and better yet, will scry for that much too. With just a few tapped artifacts, Alibu can set up the top of the deck so much that Amanatu players get jealous, and there are a lot of very clever tricks hiding in plain sight on Alibu's EDH Rec page. We've seen a lot of these cards in other artifact decks before, but don't let that fool you. Alibu is using them in a very different way and for very different ends. Let's do it to it! We'll grab Alibu's average deck list from the average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the list cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. It's very easy to underestimate Alibu. Even as we look over this average deck, there are little details here that I think trick our brains a bit. A great deal of the data appears to be influenced by the Osgear pre-constructed deck in which Alibu was first released. And that subtly affects the way we engage with Alibu's capabilities. Osgear is one of the most popular red and white commanders ever printed, shooting up to the 28th most popular commander overall in a very short amount of time. And this, subconsciously, makes us compare Osgear to Alibu, especially when they share so many cards in common in the 99. So I hope this video can help break that train of thought, because these commanders don't use the same cards in the same ways, and their goals are wildly dissimilar. Trust me, you haven't lived until you've attacked with a tiny little Thopter and dealt someone 19 damage and then scryed 19 cards all at once. Alibu is wild. Let's judge this deck on its own merits and prove just how rad and unique this commander actually is. Also, let me again give a big thank you to Chase, aka Mana Curves, for working on this video with me. You can find their deck list in the description below, and don't forget to check out the Command Zone's most recent Extra Turns episode with Chase and I if you want to see an Alibu deck in action. No spoilers though! Alright, before we can make any swaps, we have to get to know Alibu's core cards. This might be a weird place to start, but truthfully, mana rocks are the bread and butter of this deck. These don't just tap for mana and accelerate our game plan, they also become outlets to help us deal more damage and scry a bunch more. Even if we don't have anything to cast with that mana, a bunch of tapped rocks becomes a boulder full of damage. And our land base, it turns out, is exactly the same way. We're happy to play every artifact land we can get our hands on because they're not just lands, they're damage. One of Alibu's most defining attributes is speed, and this is one of the chief things that sets this deck apart from other Lorehold contemporaries. The more mana rocks we play, the sooner we can play Alibu, and the sooner we play Alibu, the more damage we can deal, and the more we get to scry to prevent ourselves from just top-decking blank cards all of the time, and instead only drawing our very favorite cards. By leaning into one specialty, mana acceleration, we also get to harness another, card selection. Shout out, by the way, to Liquimetal Torque in particular, which I know I gush about in nearly every video these days, but it is especially good here, turning any old thing into an extra artifact to tick up Alibu's damage count. In general, this deck has an extreme fondness for self-tapping artifacts, and this definitely extends to our mana-producing creatures. I especially like Ornithopter of Paradise, since it has flying. Remember, Alibu doesn't have to deal damage to the opponent that we're attacking. We can attack player 1 with a little 0 damage flyer that they can't block, but then deal like 10 damage to player 3. It's wicked. There are tons of artifacts that don't tap all on their own, though, and that's why Alibu's other favorite cards include this tapping trio. Lodestone can tap anything to get huge, while the Ether Grid helps us tap them down to deal additional damage. It's also pretty common for Alibu to use Clock of Omens to tap down everything, not even trying to be tricky about untapping stuff, just trying to get as many things tapped as possible. It's nice not to have to swing in with every single creature to get all of them tapped. The deck also rounds itself out with a natural number of typical artifact supporters as well, especially those that help produce additional tokens. A couple extra Thopters will go a really long way, and will never say no to extra copies of our artifacts either. Chase mentioned that they're especially fond of cards like the Canonist, Bronze Guardian, and Shimmermere, which provide extra protections for the deck, slowing up enemies to give Alibu time to prepare a huge damage blast, or helping avoid potential removal. Another must-mention best friend of Alibu is Strionic Resonator, allowing us to double up that damage trigger and scry a whole bunch multiple times in a row. This deck's means of accruing card advantage are very unlike the typical draw that many other decks usually value, but combining all that scry with effects like Mystic Forge can chain through tons of cards. And hey, Oswald Fiddlebender can help us find even more important pieces too, such as the one, the only, the biggest, the baddest, the Mycosynth Lattice. When every single card is an artifact, Alibu takes a board of 9 damage to a board of like 22 damage. When paired with Hellkite Tyrant, you can straight up just nab every permanent an opponent controls, and most likely just win the game on the very next upkeep. And if we're afraid of tapping everything and leaving ourselves defenseless, no worries! Unwinding Clock is one of our very favorite ways to reset. Again, though, Mycosynth isn't a card that we're just playing for value. It's endgame. When we slap that on the table, it's make or break. Alright, that was a lot of info, but you know how Lorehold is, always full of too much history. Let's get going though. We'll make upgrades in the following 3 ways. First, there are some squeaky wheels for us to grease up. Second, we'll discuss some matters of mana. And third, we'll talk about the reconstruction period, which is to say we need to reconstruct the ways that we think about this deck and also reconstruct our enemies' life totals down to 0. Let's kick it off with part 1. There's a lot to get into, but Alibu is a Strixhaven teacher, so we can't immediately jump into the advanced techniques. Rather, we have to cover some simple, basic upgrades first. We'll start off with some simple quality of life improvements. This deck contains a Rip Apart, which isn't an objectively bad card or anything, but I do think we'd be better served to exchange it for a Wear and Tear. We'll almost never need the sorcery speed 3 damage effect when we could have instant speed artifact and enchantment removal. It's good modality and much better versatility overall. I'm also going to give just a little side-eye to this here Thopter Engineer. It creates a Thopter, but only one time, and then it gives our stuff haste, which our commander does already. This can be cool in other artifact decks, but haste is not a thing that this deck struggles with. Instead, I'd rather use this card slot to help out a bit with card advantage, which is always an effect that we could use some more of. Let's get Reckless Impulse in here. A lot of folks have been calling this card the Red Knight's Whisper, effectively drawing 2 cards for 2 mana, and I think it looks even better when Alibu helps us set up the impulse draw with a bunch of scrying. There's actually just one more swap to make in this section, but it's a weird one. It turns out this deck has become a home to a brand new Voltron vehicle, the Mech Titan Core. To be clear, this card is rad. Y'all saw how much I loved it in the last video. It's a little odd in this deck, though. The actual Voltron token isn't really the biggest appeal for Alibu. Alibu's favorite piece of text on this card is actually the part that lets us tap a bunch of creatures without risking their lives in combat. The Voltron token is a cool goal, but it's very important for us to note that it reduces the number of artifacts we have in play, and that is a bit antithetical to Alibu's primary game plan, getting as many artifacts into play as we can. So I propose that we instead switch the Megazord out for a different vehicle. The Weatherlight. Still a great tap outlet, and always remember that you can over-accrue a vehicle if you want to get a bunch of stuff tapped. But this one also fits our plan a little better by helping us dig to find even more artifact cards, which is way more in line with what Alibu's after. It's a short and sweet section 1, but now it's time for us to get granular. Let's talk about our mana base. One of my favorite things ever in Commander are the amazing ways that you can stuff a bunch of cool tricks into your mana base, and Alibu is a particularly terrific example of a commander that gets a bunch of free value right there from the mana resources that we were already going to play anyway. Chase and I deliberated a bit about the deck's starting mana base. 33 lands is low, far lower than I'd usually advise for most archetypes out there. But Alibu is a pretty unique case. The deck is all about speed, and that's why we have such a surplus of mana acceleration. And of course, we also have a huge scry engine in the command zone that will help us generally find or avoid any extra mana sources as we do or do not need them. Chase and I agreed that the deck could probably use like one more land, but this deck's a lot more in danger of flooding out than it is of having no mana at all. So we will be adding a land and tinkering with the mana base in general, but before we can add, we must cut to make room, and my eye goes right to this here monologue tax. There's a lot of discourse around this card, and no, it's no Smothering Tithe, but also no, it doesn't need to be. However, I definitely think this enchantment is ill-advised in an artifact deck. I've been using it in my Thalisse deck, where the extra treasure tokens sometimes help produce extra spirit tokens, but here, this card misses on several marks. We'd basically always rather have a tapped mana rock that would let our commander deal more damage. So for now, we'll bid this card adieu. And actually, while we're discussing mana accelerants, there's a card here that doesn't seem to be worth its price. Before we get to the lands, I think we gotta talk about Forsaken Monument. There's a lot to recommend about this card, but Chase and I both agreed this card isn't well served in this deck. It pumps up our colorless creatures, but our commander is not a colorless creature, and in fact several of our creatures are not colorless. It gains us some life, but that's not really a primary concern for an aggro deck. And since we deal a bunch of damage just by attacking with like a single Thopter token in this deck, we don't really need to go out of our way to spend 5 mana on a conditional Anthem either. I know it technically has synergy with the Mycosynth Lattice turning everything colorless, but remember, Mycosynth is the end game, and it draws a lot of attention. So an Anthem effect isn't really a worthwhile payoff for our #1 star card. Rather, the main appeal of this card appears to be its mana acceleration potential. But even that gives us some problems, because a great deal of our mana acceleration does not actually produce colorless mana. There are, at present, around 13-ish, 14-ish cards that produce colorless mana in this deck. To be clear, that includes all of our lands, so the overwhelming majority of our mana output involves colored mana production. Forsaken Monument is a very interesting piece of work, it's true, but there are a bunch of little speed bumps that are adding up here, and on top of all of those, it's an artifact that we will have difficulty actually ever tapping. So I'm inclined to put our money elsewhere, and instead fill this card slot with a mana rock that will pay off some very hilarious dividends. Skyclave Relic, the actually strictly better Darksteel Ingot. With a little kick, it's not just one artifact, it's 3 of them, so it's fine whenever we need a quick boost, but it's also a very meaningful late game draw. It's +3 damage, +3 scry, and oh yeah, also +3 mana. Alright, now let's play around with the mana base a little, and get a few more utility lands in here. Slayer Stronghold is a cute and sneaky card for Alibu, and the rare occurrence that Alibu is the only creature we can get into play, especially after, say, a bout of board wipes for instance, it's nice to have a free haste outlet in the mana base so that we can attack with an artifact creature right away. Remember that we're adding 1 land, but most of these cards are being swapped in exchange for basics. I also personally like to use Boros Garrison and Guildless Commons here as well. I thoroughly enjoy bounce lands. They are terrific in landfall decks. I love using them to overload my hand so I can discard to hand size in my Reanimator decks, but I also just enjoy them in decks that have low land counts to help smooth over any potential shortages. I feel a lot better about keeping a 2-land hand when one of them is a bounce land, you know? Here's my favorite option though. I want some creature lands in this deck, stat. Mishra's Factory and Blinkmoth Nexus can both animate into little artifact creatures, which Alibu can then use to attack and dome someone for a bunch of damage. Or even if we don't want to attack with these creatures specifically, it's pretty rad to just tap them for mana, then use their own mana to animate them so that they are a tapped artifact that Alibu will count. Bonus artifacts in the mana base? Don't mind if I do. Sweet deal! Our mana base just got a bit deadlier, so it's time to round things out by upgrading the deck's heaviest hitters. Because Alibu came out in an artifact pre-constructed deck, and because its ability cares about having a lot of artifacts in play, it's really easy for us to mentally sort this deck into the artifact archetype box in our minds. But that's not a 100% accurate viewpoint. I mean, it's an artifact deck, for sure, but it's more accurate for us to say that it's an artifact burn deck. And if we're trying to apply a bunch of artifact deck building heuristics to this commander, well, I think we'd actually just end up holding it back from unleashing its true potential. Basically, there are some cards here, especially creatures, that are much more important for Osgir than they are for Alibu, and trying to play them for Alibu just won't line up with how this deck actually wants to function. Of particular import are these 3, Combustible Gearhulk, Triplicate Titan, and Steel Hellkite. Gearhulk is a strong value piece in Osgir decks, where you can make multiple copies of it and frequently flit it in and out of the graveyard. Hellkite is fairly similar, never a bad card in any deck, but a little ill-fitting in this one. And Triplicate Titan practically requires graveyard synergies in order to get into play at all. Now, to be fair, this deck does contain a small number of graveyard recursion effects, like Duretti, Wake the Past, and the Welder. These kinds of cards could cheat those big baddies into play, so why cut those big creatures when the deck still has cards that make use of the graveyard that way? This is tough to answer, but I've played enough graveyard decks in my day to know that some decks use Reanimator effects because it's a dedicated Reanimator deck, and other decks use Reanimator effects because they're terrific insurance policies. The rest of this deck's 99 just isn't committed to running a bunch of rummaging and discard effects that help load stuff into the yard and then cheat them back into play. A card like Wake the Past is there to get us back into the game if someone blew up all of our stuff. Welder trades a Thopter token for that Lodestone Mirror we need to get back that the green player got rid of a few turns ago. These cards are used by Alibu in a much more honest way, and that use won't reanimate these three big bads regularly enough to get a bunch of value from them. And if we spend all of our time trying to get individual big bads in play, then we're kind of distracting ourselves from the cool stuff that is more unique to Alibu. Alibu wants a board that goes wide, not tall. So in exchange for these cards, what are some of those cool things that Alibu could do? Let's get to it. First, of course, the deck contains the famous Lattice. Turn everything into an artifact, Alibu's damage skyrockets. And, well, since opponents already know that where a Mycosynth treads, trouble tends to follow, I'm gonna take a leaf out of Chase's book here. Vandal Blasting a fully metal board is, pretty game-winning, gotta say. I mean, heck, this deck already contains a Hellkite Tyrant, so why not commit to the bit, right? And things will be over in pretty short order when Alibu is dishing out 20 damage at a time against a completely empty board. Plus, it's just a good piece of work even without the Mycosynth around. Assert your dominance as the only artifact deck allowed at the table. That's not the only cue I'm taking from Chase, though. The next recommendation is Grafted Exoskeleton. Alibu's damage is already pretty scary when it's able to clock someone for 8, 9, 10 damage, but then this little thing comes around and makes all that a lot scarier. Why should all of the other colors get to have the most fun with Infect? Alibu slaps this thing on and jumps into battle. It goes from Alibu Ancient Witness to Alibu Ancient Witness Me! Alright, those cards were really intense though, so I'm going to close with a totally jank and yet somehow hilarious pick. Mishra's Self-Replicator. 5 mana for a 2/2 is not good. Paying 1 mana to make another token is also just kind of bleh. It's easy to write off, especially at this mana cost. But then again, this deck already contains cards like Mirrorsmith and Digsite Engineer, which actually turn out to be hugely important for the deck. Alibu loves all those extra bodies, and those creatures turn out an actually surprising number of extra tokens. So we're actually playing a lot of this effect already, and I say we keep doing it. Plus, Alibu's strategy naturally is so full of so many extra mana rocks that it turns out we frequently have a lot of extra mana to spare. The Self-Replicator is no Scoot Swarm, it's true, but when 1 turns to 2 and that 2 turns to 4, and basically at any point after that, any extra mana we happen to have lying around will be used to create 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 more tokens, I'd say we're doing pretty darn well for ourselves, and our opponents had better be on their guard. Even if they can fend off a bunch of 2/2s, our opponents won't be able to deal with all the extra damage that these 2/2s are helping Alibu beam right to their face. Those are the official swaps, but before we go, let's wrap up with some honorable mentions. If you're playing on a lighter budget than this current list, what are some alternatives that you could pursue? First, I want to point out that $180 of this deck's budget is wrapped up in just 6 cards. Ignore these 6 and you cut the price of the deck by more than half. This is one of the most important lessons for us to keep in mind when we're building on a budget. A deck's budget is rarely spread out evenly across the entire 99, but rather is more often wrapped up in just a small number of cards. And let's be real, even though these are all very cool artifacts, it's not like the deck can't function without them. Alibu's too wily to let that hold us back. So in their place, I think a few protective pieces are useful here to give the deck a bit more staying power. Rebecca in particular makes it a lot easier to get our attackers into the red zone without ever falling prey to anything. I'd also check out Iron Soul Enforcer as another means to get back key artifacts our opponents might have tampered with, especially when Alibu gives it haste to attack right away. I'll give a shout out to another vehicle here too, Cultivator's Caravan. It's a mana rock which Alibu really likes, and it's a tap outlet when we need it too. Not bad. In fact, when in doubt, frankly, you can make this deck just Mana Rock Tribal. More Mana Rocks means more damage and more scrying to find what we need. But I'll also give a weird shout out to the card Toralf while I'm at it. He's not an artifact himself, and you have to be careful how many non-artifact cards that you add to this deck, since it fundamentally cares about having as many artifacts as possible. But this is also the type of card that just really makes me giggle. We're usually dealing our bunches of damage to someone's face, but Toralf lets us choose to instead pick off basically their whole board with Alibu's trigger, and that's kind of amazing. Oh, and feel free to try a few extra combat effects in this deck too if you want Alibu to get especially spicy. Alright, now to the inverse. What if you want to upgrade Alibou's bronze face to a gold one? Well, first I'll shout out a card that I couldn't fit into this deck because of the budget restriction, and that's Kuldotha Forgemaster. Finding that Mycosynth or Darksteel Forge to get the game plan kicked into high gear is pretty amazing stuff. It's not even a terribly pricey card in comparison to some of the other cards we'll discuss in a moment, but it was out of budget when making this video. I'll shout out War Room for the same reason. Not the priciest card in the world, but it's a couple bucks, and it's a good pickup if you're upgrading and just want a little bit more draw. Then we get to some of the real high-cost cards. There are the obvious ones like Teferi's Protection and Jeska's Will, which are, bonkers, but then there are some very tricky cards like Karn, which, in conjunction with Mycosynth Lattice, will lock down the board. However, I know that hard locks like this are not necessarily everyone's cup of tea, and frankly that may even go for the Hellkite Tyrant and the Vandal Blast picks as well. I'll briefly mention, by the way, a quick strategy note for some upgrades here too. Since the Lattice makes all things colorless, this presents a pretty interesting conundrum for a few cards you might consider for the deck. Ugin, for instance, and also All is Dust. Normally, these are pretty terrific cards for an artifact deck, since they greatly benefit the artifact player, especially All is Dust, which often leaves most artifacts untouched while ravaging enemy boards. You have to be careful about these things with the Lattice though, since suddenly everything is colorless. This assists Ugin's cost reduction, but it turns off the removal effect. None of these are severely disqualifying non-bows or anything like that. They could all still be worth playing in the same deck because of how powerful they are individually, but it is definitely the kind of thing that we should keep in mind while we're making big upgrades. Moving on with even more high-budget options, I personally think that a Lithoform engine is worth looking into, although it is a bit more mana to get online than the Strionic Resonator that we're already playing, so we do have to be mindful of that. But speaking of copying things, I absolutely have to highlight one of Chase's favorites for this deck, and that's the card Helm of the Host. Multiple copies of Alibu, each giving each other haste, counting each other as more tapped artifacts, and each doming other players twice as often? Yeah, sign me up. This is living the dream. Okay, I think that'll do it for us. You can find a link to this deck and to Chase's deck list in the description box below, with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you enjoyed witnessing the Ancient Witness, and if you'd like to share your notes with your fellow Lorehold classmates, make sure you leave your tips and tricks for Alibu down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.